Many languages around the world have gone extinct. They no longer exist because there's no one left to speak them, study them, or do whatever other things we do with tongues. Others, like Latin, are classified as dead, meaning they don't have any native speakers, but they still serve niche purposes, like religious ceremonies. With urbanization and the exodus from rural areas, the global trend today is towards less linguistic diversity. This means that by the end of this century, quite a few languages now alive will be dead. Now, is it possible to reverse the trend? Humans are believed to have only one life. Since no one has ever come back from the dead to tell us otherwise, we'll just assume it's true. But what about languages? Are they like us, normal people, having to say goodbye to the fun of coffee break conversations or tax reports when the Grim Reaper shows up? Or can a language actually get a second chance at life? Well, as it turns out, one language among the thousands that have been sent to the grave appears to have managed to claw its way back into the land of the living: Hebrew. Before a language can die, it first has to, be born. While we don't know the exact date, time, or place Hebrew first emerged, linguists generally agree it started being spoken in the Levant around the 13th or 12th century BCE. Hebrew belongs to the Semitic language family, meaning it's a sister language to Phoenician, Aramaic, or Arabic, and its closest ancestor may be Proto-Canaanite. By around 800 before the Common Era, Hebrew started being written using the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet. It kept the script until the 6th or 5th century BCE, when it was mostly swapped out for the Aramaic alphabet, the main script used in Babylon. The shift was precipitated by the first exile of the Jews. When he marched on Jerusalem in 587 BCE, Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II destroyed the Temple of Solomon after the kingdom of Judah, a vassal to his empire since 597, had refused to pay its tribute, forcing the Jews into captivity, a move that was probably meant to reduce the likelihood of another rebellion in this key geographical region at the heart of the trade routes to Egypt. During the Babylonian captivity, the Jews continued to put their liturgy into writing, which helped to preserve a century-long tradition of shaping Hebrew as a sophisticated literary language. But was it really still spoken then? Hard to tell. The Jews may well have adopted Aramaic, the lingua franca of the region at the time. A lot of uncertainties remain, but what's sure is that if it was still spoken, it was most likely already heavily influenced by Aramaic. To some extent, Hebrew was already in decline then, so what precipitated its death? After the Babylonian exile ended in 538 BCE with Cyrus the Great's conquest of Babylon, the Jews were allowed to return to Judah, now known as Yehuda Medinata, a province of the Achaemenid Empire. While Hebrew remained central for religious and literary purposes, Aramaic continued to serve as the common language of the empire. Many returning Jews were bilingual, and this bilingualism influenced Hebrew. The linguistic shift is evident in the latter parts of the Hebrew Bible, such as Daniel and Ezra, which include Aramaic texts. These show that Aramaic was used alongside Hebrew, particularly in administrative and legal settings. So was it already dead then? Again, hard to tell. Aramaic remained the lingua franca of the region for hundreds of years, and it's difficult to envisage Aramaic didn't play a huge part in their exchanges and interactions with the world around them, while Hebrew may still have been used with fellow Jews alongside its use in prayer. Whether or not it was still the native language of Jewish kids, it reached its final stage nonetheless after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 of the Common Era. For years, tensions between the Jews and the Roman authorities had been rising, driven by harsh taxes, Roman interference in religious practices, and numerous conflicts with Roman governors. These tensions ultimately led to the Great Revolt, which was crushed by the Romans under the command of Titus. The Second Temple was destroyed, and much of the Jewish population was either killed or enslaved. Not all Jews were expelled, though. Some remained in Judah and surrounding areas, but the communities were weakened and tightly controlled by the Romans. A fragile Jewish presence lasted until the Bar Kokhba revolt, triggered by Emperor Hadrian's suppression of Jewish customs. After crushing the revolt, Hadrian banned Jews from Jerusalem, renamed the region Syria-Palestina, probably in reference to its name during the Iron Age, and scattered the remaining population across the Roman Empire. By 135 of the Common Era, Hebrew had virtually ceased to be a spoken language, surviving only as a liturgical language. Even so, there were efforts to preserve it. For example, around the turn of the 3rd century, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi compiled the Mishnah, the first major codification of Jewish law, using Hebrew. However, Mishnaic Hebrew was so heavily influenced by Aramaic, you could say it was a hybrid between the two. Regardless, these efforts didn't prevent Hebrew from further fading as a spoken language, and by the 6th century, the Talmud was written mainly in Aramaic. Throughout the Middle Ages and up until the 18th century, Hebrew continued to be used in religious contexts by rabbis or intellectuals, but also in poetry, notably in Muslim Spain and Yemen. Many Arabic-speaking Jews also preserved the alphabet by writing Arabic texts in the Hebrew script. However, the language itself was essentially dead. It was the native language of no one. Interestingly, the language also served as a lingua franca between Jews from the diaspora, scattered in different countries with languages that were not mutually intelligible. Of course, this use of the language by Jews in different parts of the world did help to preserve the language, but also led to significant shifts and to the development of different pronunciations, ultimately leading to different variations. But this was about to come to an end. The revival of the Hebrew language was a tale of two movements coming together, the literary revival on one side and the spoken one on the other. At first, these took place in separate spheres. Literary Hebrew was flourishing in European cities, while spoken Hebrew began its cautious comeback in Palestine. The revival of Hebrew as a literary language began during the Haskalah, which emerged as the Jewish counterpart of the Enlightenment during the 18th and 19th centuries. This was when Jewish intellectuals started seeing Hebrew as more than just a language for religious texts. It could also be a tool for art and literature. Inspired by the Bible, early writers embraced its pure vocabulary and poetic style. This worked well for exploring ancient themes and religious ideas, but for modern life, yeah, not so much. So, some bold writers took on the task of experimenting with Hebrew to express new concepts, paving the way for a more flexible and modern version of the language. This was notably the case of the early translations of Jules Verne's novels. But this was essentially an intellectual movement that didn't spread much outside the so-called big brain spheres. It's actually the politics of the whole project that properly put things in motion. The spoken revival was mostly driven by the first wave of Zionist Jews migrating to Palestine. They needed a common language for daily life and business, and Hebrew fit the bill. But it wasn't until the early 1900s, when more European Jews started arriving, that the literary and spoken revivals began to converge, and that real work was started. The migration to Palestine is usually divided into two movements called the First and Second Aliyah, and both marked a significant turning point in the development of modern Hebrew in the larger political project of the creation of a Jewish state. It is during the first Aliyah that Eliezer Ben-Yehuda, known as the reviver of the Hebrew language, stepped onto the scene. In the late 19th century, Ben-Yehuda, born in the Russian Empire and heavily influenced by the works of the Haskalah, joined the first wave of Jewish migration to Palestine, which was then under Ottoman rule. A dedicated Zionist, Ben-Yehuda firmly believed that the Hebrew language can live only if we revive the nation and return it to the fatherland. Reviving Hebrew was thus as much of a linguistic project as a political one. The first Aliyah focused on laying the groundwork for a Hebrew-speaking society. During this period, the first Hebrew schools were established in the agricultural settlements known as moshavot. These schools began the task of teaching Hebrew, even though it wasn't yet widely spoken in daily life. In 1885, Ben-Yehuda founded the Clear Language Society, dedicated to promoting spoken Hebrew, and by 1890, the Hebrew Language Committee was already busy crafting new words to fill the gaps left by ancient Hebrew. Needless to say, the language was reflecting life as it was about 2,000 years prior. Quite a few things had changed since. He heavily relied on other Semitic languages, especially Arabic, to coin words for modern concepts, foods, and appliances, while old Hebrew words also got fresh meanings. Despite the initial skepticism of some, Hebrew schools slowly gained traction, and the first Hebrew-speaking families began to emerge, setting the stage for what was to come. The second Aliyah marked a turning point for Hebrew, pushing it from classrooms into public life. In the Moshavot, Hebrew became the default language for public meetings, debates, and even casual conversations among the Jewish immigrants. Education was at the heart of this transformation. The Hebrew Language Committee took the lead in standardizing grammar and pronunciation, favoring the Sephardi one, deemed closer to original Hebrew. Some schools even banned Yiddish, a Germanic language that originated in the 9th century among Ashkenazi Jews in Central Europe, insisting that students and their parents stick to Hebrew. The founding of Tel Aviv in 1909 as the first all-Hebrew city was a clear milestone. By the time the First World War rolled around, Hebrew was no longer a pipe dream. With 34,000 native speakers and a flourishing print culture of newspapers, books, and plays, it was becoming a fully alive and evolving language. By the time the British Mandate began, Hebrew had gone mainstream. In 1922, the British recognized it as one of Palestine's official languages, alongside English and Arabic. By the 1940s, Hebrew had matured into a fully modern language, ready for its ultimate role as the official language of the Jewish state, officially founded in 1948. Every new immigrant was required to learn the language, and the compulsory military service for both males and females facilitated this language acquisition, as modern Hebrew was taught as part of the training. As you see, the modernization of Hebrew was anything but simple. It took centuries of ideological, cultural, and practical work to turn a biblical language into a modern one. Now, it's difficult to estimate to what extent modern Hebrew resembles in any way Hebrew as it used to be way back in the days, but it's unlikely an old Hebrew speaker would be able to understand it. Many Jewish immigrants were native Yiddish speakers, and some even saw Yiddish as a potential language for a Jewish state. However, Zionists viewed Hebrew as a symbol of renewal and nationhood, while Yiddish was seen as a relic of exile. Advocates for Hebrew worked to make it the dominant language, and they largely succeeded, yet Yiddish left its mark. Early Hebrew speakers, mostly Ashkenazi Jews, couldn't entirely shed their native language, and elements of Yiddish pronunciation, grammar, and humor blended into modern Hebrew. In this regard, the idea the language was revived is debatable, but the endeavor can surely serve as an inspiration for other languages worldwide. Let me know your thoughts on the subject in the comments. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching, and maybe see you next time.